Hello and welcome to this lecture on Adobe Photoshop by Eduonics. This is a continuation of the drawing lecture I was doing before, and I'm just going to do this one in high speed, and I'll pause to explain things that I'm doing and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, I'm going to draw out the rest of this Rhino, and I'm going to time lapse it. So you can see what I'm doing, and I'm by all means a perfect artist or anything, but hopefully you can get something from this. The screen will look like this when there's a little note. Since I'm doing this in time lapse, you have that. Originally I was going to have it silent, but I'm recording audio over it so I can kind of explain better what's going on. I'm always doing a little combination of cleanup, and you always want to zoom in. If there's one thing I can't stress enough, it's to zoom in when you're doing detail, especially because, and there's a lot of reasons, that your pen doesn't work as well at lower resolutions or at lower zoom levels. But also your eyes then work better when you're zoomed in. And if you, just a good example is to draw something and look at it. Draw something really tiny and then look at it and then zoom in on it to see exactly how off you were. You might draw a cube or something. So here I've drawn this out up to this point. I just blocked in general color. So what I'm going to be doing in this tutorial is adding texture, and I'm going to be accomplishing that through adding values. So one thing when you're painting, and it's what I wrote a little note about there for, is to use the eyedropper tool to pick up similar colors. It'll save you a lot of time. If you hit the eyedropper tool and just pick up what you want, because you kind of have your palette in front of you after a certain point, and a lot of people like to also pick up or to lay out their colors in little swatches like you might have on a painting. But I'm always looking over at the left side, so I laid it out like this. I'm always looking at big blocks. I'm not looking at lines or proportions as much as I am at looking at big blocks. I'm keeping proportions in mind, but that's about it. So I'll continuously be like merging these layers and continuously be using masks and such. You might want to set your history to a larger amount to do a drawing, and that's because small little brush strokes don't take up a lot of space in the history, so you can actually have more history states if you're just doing that. And one thing to note too, well, I'll skip that for now, but keep in mind if you're doing this, it's probably digital, and not to worry too much about making mistakes as long as you're using new layers and you're not destroying anything. I'm kind of a little crazy with my layers, but I just make sure that if I want something to be on top, that I put it on top. But use the tools Photoshop gives you, for example, blurring. You can smooth out areas where you can really see the brush strokes. Notice that I'm constantly activating, deactivating layers. You can make a layer darker too. So if you notice also that certain parts of this I didn't go all the way with the darkness, and just in case you're wondering, this is for a client. It's going to be a humorous picture in the end, but that's why I've chosen this particular view of the Rhino. You don't see it that often, but I thought that might need some explaining. Knowing that I'm going to be using blur, and then I can come in and I can really just put a bunch of loose lines like that in. You generally want the strokes to coincide with the texture, so if it's got a lot of creases going left and right, then you want your strokes to be horizontal, and if it's got a lot of like stripes going up and down or something, then and these are just textural stripes, and you want your strokes to go up and down because you'll accidentally end up making the texture a little bit, at least more so than you would if you were going against the grain, against the direction. So with like the ribs, I'll hold my brush and kind of like I'm touching the ribs, like I'm just um, smoothing over them with my hand, like I'm feeling them, as opposed to like I'm just smacking my fingers on them like you're walking by a fence or something. You want to go with the direction, whatever it is you're drawing. Another thing is that don't worry about doing it in one stroke. Make a bunch of tiny strokes that go together, especially if the end result, you're trying to, if it's going to look like a drawing. Even when you're just doing pencil lines, thin lines, people are generally acceptant when they see a drawing and they see that the lines have been made that way. And the better you get, the less it'll look like a bunch of lines. It'll look like one soft line. Now, Rhino is a pretty easy subject in the sense of it's already kind of black and white. I would typically change my color temperature to make it a little bit warmer in this case. Just rather cool gray. That's something that's neither here nor there. So what I'm doing now is I'm just lightening up the face, and I'm eventually going to blur the face. I'm trying to make it match the left side as much as possible. And I'm going to blur it a little because it's so far in the foreground. I want to give it a sense of depth. And if you're using the mixer brush, I recommend turning the wetness down, starting from 0 wetness, and then eventually turning it up. And wetness just makes things unnecessarily dark, in my opinion. If you really want that effect of using a brush, though, I guess it's a good thing. But generally, keep looking over at my history um, panel to see what I'm doing. You'll see the last thing that I did is generally using a brush, and check out the options at the top to see what my opacity is, and you eventually might get a feel for what I'm doing. And obviously check out the color to see what I'm painting with. Another thing to note is, as you can tell, this background, there is no background, so I just have the white because it makes it easier for me to see. And just like I mentioned before, I'll be drawing with a Marquee though. And I think this panel says it all. So So when you're blurring something or when you're doing anything, if you have that hard edge, it it becomes very visible because of the effect. You have the effect on one pixel, and the very next pixel doesn't have that effect, and it goes in a line obviously because of the line of your selection. So you want to blur that so you can't really tell where it starts and where it ends. And that's blurring your actual selection, not blurring the stuff that you have selected, but taking the actual selection marquee and blurring the edge of it. And so I only blurred kind of one edge, but the rest of it went off. Here I've made a brush out of the texture I want to use, and as you can see, it's not as easy as just brushing it in. I'll be blurring the edges, and I'll be making it kind of broken in places because this isn't. You don't want the pattern to stick out if you ever do use a pattern. This is kind of unconventional for drawing, but like what we're doing with Photoshop is we want to use as much of the program as we can because this isn't conventional drawing. This is digital art. So once you've entered into that realm, you want to use, you want to just make complete use of it. I'm using crazy transformations and all kinds of stuff that's going to benefit the illustration in the end, and that's what gives digital art. That's what makes it so powerful, is because you can do things like that you can't do with conventional painting. You'll see here as I eventually put a bunch of blending modes on it. I always reuse as much as possible. So instead of stamping that entire thing out on the left side, I'll just end up copying and modifying what I have. You want to keep these things as separate too. Obviously I wasn't stamping directly on the Rhino's skin, I was stamping on a blank layer above it. Because you want to keep like your textures separate, you want to keep maybe your whites on another layer. Of course that depends on who you are. And it depends on your transparency too. You might not even want to mess around with the edges like I was just cleaning up there. You might just want to put a clipping mask on the whole thing. I'm not going to mess around with the shadow either. One thing you will know is if you're doing it in the same technique as I do, that when you make your background invisible so that it's showing through, you find out that white was definitely a huge part of your drawing like you just saw. So I end up just creating a mask around the Rhino, even if I have to draw it in manually, and then saving that portion of the background, keeping it behind the Rhino, even merging it. I'm blurring this section of leg because the strokes were very visible. So you can see on the left side I've done kind of a completely different technique that I'll be utilizing. What I can of the other side too. Now I like to leave little things that, so as you can see, I could blur this whole thing out and make it look really smooth, but I like to leave things in there because obviously this is a drawing, and I want it to look a little bit like a drawing. I don't know if I get to it in this one, but anyway, that's the gist of it. So that about does it for this tutorial. That's the finished Rhino pretty much, or it will be in a couple seconds. Just keep practicing, and if you need to see a part again, just pause it and zoom in or whatever. Thanks for watching.